is Sean Cleland. I'm the director of the Irish Music School of Chicago. And I'd like to welcome you here tonight. Before we start, if you could acknowledge and give a round of applause to Nancy Moore back there from the Irish American Heritage Center, and Barbara, who's working for you guys. That's Barbara. Nancy's got blondie hair. She's at the bar. And why we're acknowledging her is that this is our third year back having our camp for the kids and the few evening things. And Nancy has been a tremendous help in making this year be the smoothest year. It's probably our biggest year too, with the amount of kids that we've got coming through in the day. And Nancy has been invaluable. And she also has to put up with a lot of me saying, I forgot to ask you about this. A lot of that, right, Nancy? She's like, yeah, okay. Also like to acknowledge our dear friend Liz Carroll over there. And one of the patrons of our school, Rich Delaney up there. Give it a round for Rich. Made a lot of this happen tonight. And I want to tell you that this is being recorded for CAN Chicago Access TV. It's a educational, non-for-profit. Is it sort of online too? Is there a channel somewhere?
Yeah, we have a YouTube channel also.
And there's a YouTube channel also. So this will be available at some point later, and we'll talk about it on Facebook and send out stuff about it. But I think this would be great. You know, part of the reason this is the first year we've ever had the camp this late. We always usually have it the very end of June. And the reason why is because over the last 2 years, in conversations with our special guest tonight, her connection to the O'Neill story and making it come alive in my own head has led me to want to have her be a part of it. And this was the only week she could come to America. So I said, oh my God. And then she wasn't gonna come, then she was gonna come, then she wasn't gonna come. I was like, it's like yo-yo dieting or something. But I think it really made a big impact on us. And so we're delighted to welcome, and under the auspices of the Fulbright Ireland Scholars, the inimitable Dr. Aileen Dillane. Give it up for her, please.
Thank you, Sean. Is this volume okay for you? Yeah. So I'd also like to thank Sean for inviting me. I was always going to come because I never need an excuse to come to Chicago. And I'd also like to thank Fulbright for supporting this journey. It's really important, and for every sponsor as well, so thank you. Just a little bit of background about myself. I'm from County Limerick. I'm from a little place called Templeglanton, where I grew up learning classical music and Irish traditional music side by side. And I did a Bachelor of Music degree in University College Cork. And while I was studying there, Irish music is on the curriculum, and we learned a lot about Irish music in college. But it was very much from the perspective of Irish music as belonging to Ireland. And while we did learn about Francis O'Neill, and we were very familiar with the collections, a lot of that encounter was very much based on how Francis O'Neill saved Irish music for Ireland. And so Chicago was there, but it was this sort of exotic background story. It wasn't kind of deeply implicated in it in particular ways, and that always struck me, and I think it stayed with me. And as I started to listen to more recordings of Irish music, recorded especially, I guess, in the United States, in New York and Boston from the 1920s and 30s onwards, that led me to do an MA based on the topic of the piano in 78 RPM recordings. And so more and more I began to fall in love with, I guess, the Irish music scene in the United States. So when I decided to pursue my PhD, I received a scholarship to attend the University of Chicago. I looked at a lot of different schools, actually, but it was really Chicago, the city itself, that drew me. Yes, the University of Chicago is a wonderful university, and I was very privileged to be there. But while I was there, I was aware that, again, O'Neill seemed to be very important locally to people. Of course, you had, this was about 1998 when I came, actually, and at that time, Francis O'Neill Club opened. There were some wonderful publications that came out. Nicholas Carlin's A Harvest Saved, an absolutely marvellous piece of work by the former director of the Traditional Music Archive in Dublin. People like Lawrence McCullough had written a thesis in 1973 on Irish music in Chicago that's still a go-to. It's absolutely wonderful. You had later on, not while I was at the university, you had Ellen Scarrett and Mary Lesh brought out the wonderful memoir of Francis O'Neill. So there was energy around it, but and then part of me felt, well, this has been done already. I'll do other things. I did write my doctoral dissertation ultimately on Irish music in Chicago, but I didn't focus on O'Neill specifically. But I began to think, actually, there's something happening here with this again, and I wanted to revisit it. And that's, I guess, a very long way of saying that he is someone who's always come up for me in my life and all the people he dealt with. And coming from a background where the notion of localness is really important in narratives of Irish traditional music. People talk a lot about the landscape of Ireland, of the pure drop coming up through the landscape of Ireland. You know, I was thinking, well, Chicago has its own unique topography, and Francis O'Neill has got to have been shaped by that. And so that's really, I guess, what this presentation is about. Now, you know, I'm a lecturer, so I read and I tend to be a little bit didactic, but I really do welcome interruptions and questions if you want any clarification. I really do, except from Sean. I'm only kidding. So if you'll bear with me, what I want to do is, I'm going to read some of this for clarity, so that I can keep my train of thought with you. I'll probably ad-lib it as well. And we'll see how we go, okay? If you need to take a break in the middle of it, just put up your hand like we're doing in the school all day. All right, do we have any questions before I begin? No? You recognize that skyline? So that's where I studied, the University of Chicago. And if you look up where the Google dot is, it's a little bit blurry, but that was Francis O'Neill's house for 40 years. So there's the Regenstein where I was studying for my comps. And I only found out when I was there that he was living just up the street. And I suppose for me, for historical figures, kind of recuperating them as, you know, flesh and blood human beings is a very important thing. So I'll begin. There has been a strong consensus amongst Irish music studies scholars and Irish music practitioners that Captain Francis O'Neill truly was a hero for saving Ireland's musical heritage by documenting it in numerous publications and returning it to its homeland, so devastated by the famine in 1845 to 1849. And there is a litany of references I could give you. Reverend Hennebree from 1908, Brandon Brannock from 1970s and 1996, Nicholas Carlin, who I mentioned, Paulette Gershon did a marvellous MA thesis on Francis O'Neill, Tomás O'Cannon in 1998. Lots of people have lauded and celebrated O'Neill for saving Irish music. Much of this praise has been predicated on O'Neill's insiderness, that is, he was working and producing music for practicing Irish musicians within the tradition, and also predicated on this notion of authenticity, which is he himself was a practicing traditional musician, and importantly for many people, an Irish-born man. And you know, O'Neill himself actually was very clever at circulating these ideas too, because he wanted to authenticate his own position as the right person to collect these collections. So he contributed to this narrative. But what I have come to appreciate was that, by and large, the relationship of O'Neill's output and his adopted city and its particular context, and by this I mean Chicago's context as a nodal point in this regional and global flow of people and of ideas and of capital, has never really been dealt with specifically by people within the tradition or in the scholarly tradition, beyond acknowledging that O'Neill was in the position to collect Irish music precisely because, of course, people had emigrated in droves to Chicago after the famine. But for me, and we can argue about this later if you want, there is no doubt that the metropolitan privileges and the opportunities afforded to O'Neill in turn of the century Chicago, and by this I mean the economic opportunities, the technological advancements, the organizational aspects of what was happening in the city, the material conditions, they all supported him, and he had a vision to establish a new truth about the unity of Irish music as he saw it. He was a very visionary man, but he had a particular purpose, and Chicago offered him a matrix for this. So for me, I don't think that his work is not just about saving Irish music for Ireland, and he did say he was doing this, but it's also about this kind of imaginary that was in his work, really bound up with, if you think about this particular period in history, kind of this rationalist impulses and entrepreneurial spirit that Chicago is so famed for. I don't know if many of you buy books on Chicago, but there are so many books about how great Chicago is and why it's this way. And some people think that's like kind of a syndrome here, or it's solipsistic. But there's lots of really interesting arguments as to why this is the case. And I think these things, they don't just happen, you know, for no reason. And there's something that was happening in this period that I guess sparked something in O'Neill himself. So it was also then about an ambitious, intelligent and driven man who wanted to create himself this totalizing narrative about Irish music in order to create books that were literally, and he said this himself, the biggest and the best. And if you think about this period in history, we do have some historians in the audience, and Sarah, you can challenge me on this or support me, I hope. You know, that in this period of the late 19th century, this is a period of the kind of emergence of the encyclopedia, of the biggest and best, of cataloguing, of kind of rationalizing, of zoning, of creating order in how we kind of consumed our knowledge. And of course this is coming out of, we won't go there tonight because it's a bit early, post-colonial theory, right? It's coming out of this idea of how do we rationalize things. And this was very much happening in Chicago, and I'll get to why I think this was the case. It's also a period of new commercial enterprises, of mass production, of mass consumption, and of technological advances. And I'm going to take you through those points, and hopefully you'll stay with me so that towards the end of the paper, I'm actually getting to O'Neill's books itself and showing you how I'm reading these things in the actual texts. So, does everybody know about O'Neill? It did occur to me there might be a few people who don't know the very basics. That he was born in County Cork. He's this extraordinary life. I can't understand why somebody hasn't made a Hollywood movie of him. It's just utterly amazing. He went on a ship and was shipwrecked and traveled the world and joined the police force, rose through the ranks very, very quickly, became chief of police 1901 to superintendent, really, 1905. And these important things as a collector, which is what I'm focusing on. Elected president of the Irish Music Club. He was one of the first people to get his own private wax cylinder. I can guarantee you, if Francis O'Neill was alive today, he would have a Twitter account, he would be on everything. You know, he would have been the first person to get the iPhone 10. You know, he would have, because he was so into media and into dissemination. And he published his first book in 1903. So these are the dates I'm going to talk about historically. So you can see there's a picture of the Irish Music Club, and that's a tune from one of his collections. Isn't that an extraordinary picture? I mean, how much fun did they have? They're far more genteel looking than this rabble here tonight. But. So these are his publications, and the ones in orange are the two that I'm going to focus on, the 1903 Music of Ireland, and then the Irish folk music, a fascinating hobby. And I suppose what I'm trying to do here, do many of you have Irish heritage in the audience? Yeah, could I just see a show of hands? Okay, so for those of you who do, you know what it's like to kind of constantly negotiate this idea of what's centre and what's periphery. You know, sometimes when you think about Ireland, it's sort of created as this authenticated centre, and the diaspora in Chicago or in Melbourne or in London is kind of on the periphery, always looking to the centre. I'm kind of flipping the script here a little and asking you to kind of put that narrative aside for the moment, and let's put Chicago right at the centre of this. So, O'Neill arrived in Chicago after the Great Fire in 1871, at a time, which I think most of you know this, the city was picking itself up from the ashes and reconfiguring itself anew with a huge building and economic boom. So from his early adventures at sea, O'Neill had proven to be imaginative and adaptable in his environment. And as evidence of his entrepreneurial skills and his ability to take advantage of situations. Scarrett and Lesh actually note how O'Neill availed of the opportunity created by the Great Fire to secure himself and other people in the Bridgeport community some unguarded lumber to build new houses. So, he was always looking for an angle, and he was good at it. Because he built a house he would have otherwise been unable to afford. But O'Neill, he also drew on the kind of symbolic and cultural capital of his education in Ireland and his musical abilities, because he's not your typical famine migrant coming from a poor background. He was what was called a scolara. He was educated. He was going to become a school teacher at the age of 15, but went down to the harbour in Cork and went, no, and jumped on a boat. So this is the kind of young man he was then. And he was somebody then who was able to rise through the ranks very quickly in Chicago. But I want us to shift away from his singular biography to the moment and to remember that until his death in 1936, that period from 1871 to 1936, can you imagine the kinds of things as a person he witnessed, the kinds of changes he saw downtown? I mean, the commercial booms, engineering, and of course, lots of other things. But I'll go through them one by one. I mean, the first thing for me would be speculative capitalism, right? You don't kind of always talk about Irish music and capitalism in the same phrase. We should, because it's a highly lucrative business, as Liz Carroll will tell us. So let's talk about Chicago as a city renowned for its futures venturing and all kinds of huckstering, and it is, huckstering city. O'Neill would have seen people make considerable money and would have also witnessed lots of economic challenges right from 1893 as well as the stock market crash in 1929 and the kind of consequences for people and the opportunities that people engaged with. You may not know this, but O'Neill was part of this speculating tradition and apparently amassed quite a considerable portfolio of investments. He was a wily investor, and through careful speculation, particularly in property, he generated quite a tidy fortune, which he used to fund projects, including his music publications. That's a very important point. He created his own means to fund his own publications. And he says this himself in one of his books. It would take money, as well as zeal and skill, to publish music. We all know that, right? This was also a period of major invention and rapid change in the landscape with the emergence of course, the very distinctive Chicago School of Architecture. And you're blessed, it's such a beautiful city. Yes, many of the buildings have been razed to the ground, but some still persist. Early skyscrapers emerged in the US. And why did they emerge? They emerged as a result of economic growth and financial organization. That's what American businesses needed. They were incentivized to use the land well. So if you can't spread out, go up. Chicago initially led the way in skyscraper design, and many were constructed in the center of the financial district during the late 1880s and 1890s. So this is the landscape that O'Neill traversed. The Chicago School of Architecture were kind of, they were building certain kinds of buildings that maybe we don't traditionally associate with skyscrapers now, but kind of square palazzo-style buildings that had shops and had various things happening on the ground floor, and then up they went, however many stories. And they not only changed the landscape and how people would kind of negotiate the city, but also the opportunities for people to work, because you put offices and you put businesses in these skyscrapers. And I think I read a statistic somewhere that between 1870 and 1890, the female population working in, typing pools and various parts of businesses, it rose exponentially. It went up 30, 40, 50%. So again, you're also talking about a change in the workforce, in the kinds of ways of negotiating. This is an important thing because I think compared with other collectors, O'Neill was, I don't know if I call him a feminist, but he was certainly open to the inclusion of women and seemed to access their musical memories and stores as well. So some of the buildings that you would have had downtown, and these would have been buildings in his era. These are things he would have seen. The Rand McNally. You also had the first skyscraper, which is the home insurance buildings. I want you to keep these in your mind because I come back to them visually and kind of metaphorically at a later date. And it's a very different landscape. That's a very different landscape that one encounters. The second thing, of course, was in the late 19th century, the sound recording industry took off with the invention of the phonograph by Thomas Edison. The patent was, I think, 1878. And the first ones, prior to the shellac recordings, the hard discs, were wax cylinders. And they were quite cutting edge. And O'Neill himself, he purchased his own phonograph so that he could make his own recordings. That's what I mean about him being at the cutting edge of technology. And he did that. And in fact, if you want to listen, 32 of those cylinders were found just under 10 years ago in an attic in Milwaukee. And they're actually in the Ward archive in Milwaukee, and they have digitized them and put them online. So if you want to hear the sound of the people who played for O'Neill, you can go online and listen to those things. So it's quite extraordinary. And they were used in his books as well. So it wasn't just the recording technology, it was also, there were amazing print rooms in Chicago, Line and Healy, where he published his books. He had access to high quality, not always cheap, but definitely good access to reproduction and to be able to do it in the city. So again, the kind of material and technological benefits were there. The third thing, of course, was transport. Chicago was already a hub for national railroads because it's a meat and grain processing industries, right? You all know this. The first commuter trains started up in 1892 and were hugely important, and along with streetcars, O'Neill and all the citizens would use these to move in and around the city. Around 1897 up to 1902, so this is when he was recording and just about to publish his works, you had some of the aldermen and their mayor, Mayor Harrison, trying to clean up the transport system to make it more integrated, and we're still not there, are we? Maybe, I don't know. I find the L is really good. But again, the transport is very important because when I get to the book with O'Neill, he talks about being on the tram and listening to tunes, and he talks about how he was able to get to different neighbourhoods. So this idea of moving around and accessibility to the city is also very important. And the last one, might seem a little less obvious, but I think it's important, is in 1886 you had the mail order business, Sears, was set up north of here and it relocated to Chicago in 1887. Then, 1892, Sears joined out with Roebuck and they started to diversify things, and the catalogue culture started. And of course, with the catalogue culture, you're getting from 1894, 332 pages of everything imaginable: sewing machines, bicycles, sports equipments, automobiles even, imagine, out of a catalogue, and a host of other new items. Lots of money in this kind of fetishizing of buying products, and a lot of these products were beautifully made. A lot of them, you know, leaned into kind of tropes of nostalgia. And again, this is very important because this commodity culture is huge, absolutely huge in Chicago. So there's an appetite. There's an appetite for the consumption of nice goods. And what we'll see when we get to O'Neill's 1903 book is that it was really beautiful. It was a beautiful object, you know, if you wanted it. So that's what I want you to keep in your mind, kind of the economic opportunities, the capitalism and the free market, the new layouts of the city in the forms of towering skyscrapers populated by new businesses, lots of money in circulation, new modes of transport, new goods to purchase. These are the things that he was encountering on a daily basis. There are other things as well. Obviously, the flip side of this is the neighbourhoods that weren't very well developed, the difficult conditions people lived in, and we will get to that in the book as well. But I'm not saying Chicago is, you know, I'm not trying to say it's an agent in this, but it certainly is a context, and it's very important to know this. But that's broader Chicago. What about ethnic Chicago? So if we look at the Great Fire, of 1871, it happened literally a few decades after the Irish famine. 1847 was possibly the worst year of that. And you all know this, there was massive immigration from Ireland to the US. Predominantly to the East Coast, specifically cities like New York and Boston, but of course many came to Chicago as well. And they came here because they were drawn by the economic opportunities available. You had factories, houses, transportation links, of course the building of the canal lines, those kinds of things. In his study on Irish Chicago and what he talks about as the shaping of an ethnic group, Michael Funchian notes that the first Irish came to Chicago actually in 1836 to build the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which was completed in 1848. So that's your first wave. And then this Irish moved to Bridgeport, and they were working mainly as unskilled labourers in meatpacking and brickyards. You had some skill too. And what he does is he goes to the census of 1870 to 1900. It's the census, the 9th to the 12th census. And he says around the time O'Neill arrived, the Irish actually nearly made up 14% of the population of the city. It's actually the highest it would ever go, was 14%. And if any of you are fans of Carl Sandburg poetry, I assume you are if you're Chicagoans, yeah? I mean, this was the city as the hog butcher of the world. It was the central of meat and corn packing. So it was very, very connected, and it was very connected to the rest of the country because everything came out from here. So if you have products moving in and out, you're going to have people moving in and out as well, and that's very important. And if you like this kind of thing, and if you're interested in the history of Chicago, can I highly recommend William Cronin's book, Nature's Metropolis. He talks about the city not as this bounded entity, but rather as something that is deeply connected to its hinterland. So the city, you have to imagine it as just radiating out and connecting to all these places across the Midwest and even maybe nationally. And it's an important point, actually, because in this way, you can put Chicago at the centre, and Irish becomes a kind of Ireland, I should say, becomes a cultural hinterland to this. So you're, again, flipping that script. O'Neill himself worked in the city, in the stockyards, like many immigrants before him and like many would after him. And he quickly joined the police force and made his way up the ranks. But he remained very close to his informants, his musical informants on the ground. And we'll get to some quotes from that. As a policeman, he would revisit many of the districts where he formerly worked. So his beat as a policeman was literally in the old stockyard neighbourhoods, particularly Bridgeport. So this method of kind of traversing the city by foot, by tram, whatever way, observing, noting, taking things down, it actually speaks to this older tradition, which is called the flaneur tradition. And at that time, you started to also have, into the 20th century, the development of the Chicago School of Urban Sociology. And in many ways, that kind of approach to looking at the city as this incubator of ideas was what they developed. And so people like Worth and Part and Burgess, this was more in the early 20th century, reinvented modern sociology by taking academic research onto the street and kind of looking at people and seeing what they're doing. Now, O'Neill was not kind of doing scientific work with his music. It was, and even though we lived in Hyde Park, I can't actually uncover any evidence if he ever gave talks or worked with the faculty there, but one imagines if he's living, 2 blocks away from this hub of intellectual engagement that he might have been influenced, he might not. It's certainly not in his library collection. But either way, he found the city just a place to be really inspired by. And Nicholas Carlin talks about how he would go into barber shops and he'd jot down melodies, or he'd be on trolley cars and he'd hear somebody whistling and he would take that down as well, or sometimes he'd stop at railway crossings. So there's these very evocative notions of him doing this and creating his own ecology of this city, where the Irish communities were, where the social groups were. Kind of, he was like an ethnographer of his time. He wouldn't have used that term. It's not a term people really are familiar with, but he was doing field work. And of course then in doing all of this, he suddenly realized, I've amassed so much detail and so many things, I should probably look at publishing something. And he did. He published, as I showed you, all of these, but I'm going to focus on one publication, and it's his very first one from 1903. Oh, actually, I won't do that first. I'll do the 1910 Irish Music, a Fascinating Hobby, and I'll tell you why. Because that particular book, even though it came out 7 years later, it's almost like the ethnographic companion to the tune books. You can look at the tune books and not know a whole lot about what's happening, but if you read Irish Music, a Fascinating Hobby, it's extraordinary. So this is what O'Neill said. He wrote it originally as a series of articles for a periodical for wide circulation, but he soon realized, and these are his words, these series of sketches dealing with the writer's research and experience of collecting music would be best served in a book form to help the cherished cause and stimulate interest in the music of Éireann. He wasn't the only one to see kind of wealth in doing this in the city. One of his colleagues who used to lecture at the University of Washington, Reverend Hennery, felt the same. Here's a quote from Hennery. Lovers of Irish music generally will be surprised and delighted, as I, Hennery, was to discover that there exists in Chicago a lively activity in this matter and in the right direction, this music. This happy condition is due to the interests and efforts of Mr. Francis O'Neill, General Superintendent of Police. I've heard much of the music of Ireland, heard it often, but never yet that played by the Chicago pipers and fiddlers of Captain Francis O'Neill. And so O'Neill is citing this in a book in 1910, citing Hennery saying these things. So this book itself, have any of you read it? Yeah? Okay, so you know all about this then. I'd be interested to see if you agree with the same take. So it's got 18 chapters, 3 appendices. I mean, it offers such a rich insight into the world of Irish music as he conceived it. He creates this. And you've got things like stories on tunes, sketches of early collections, remarks on Irish dance. And in the first chapter, he's very careful to set himself up. He kind of moves very fluidly between recollections of his life in Cork, and he focuses on the Irishness of Irish music, and he evokes the names of characters of musicians, and he talks about our national music. So it feels like it's a very Irish project. But he is also implicating Chicago very early on. And one of the things he's keenly aware of at the start is, he says that it's singularly, in relation to Ireland, the singularly unfortunate national, political and industrial conditions there would make it impossible, in Ireland, it would make it impossible to do a collection like this. The only place this could happen is here, and so I'm going to make it happen. And that's what he does. What he said was, salvation for the Irish tradition, and this is where this narrative of saving Irish music emerges, comes from, and I quote, the galaxy of Irish musicians domiciled in Chicago. A galaxy of you. You're still a galaxy, I think. Very much so. And, he was able to do this because he could afford the print culture. He had all these amazing musicians around him, and that's what he was going to do. In chapters 1, 2, and I think 10, no, it's 11, he also talks about the influences, experiences, and love of music, and his acquaintances with musicians of Chicago, the process of collection, and these amusing incidents and experience that he had. And for me, they're the ones that are really worth reading if you want to get a sense of his Chicago, because he talks about how he'd come around and access tunes. I love this one, and I share this one with students where I teach at the University of Limerick, and for me it's very evocative. One summer in 1875, the strains of a fiddle coming through the shutters of an old dilapidated building on Cologne Street attracted my attention. The musician was an old man named Dillane, who lived alone, and whom I'd seen daily wielding a long-handled shovel on the streets, so he was a labourer. His only solace in his solitary life, beside his dudeen, which was his pipe, was Jenny, as he affectionately called his fiddle. A most captivating jig memorised from his playing, I named Old Man Dillane in his honour. Isn't it beautiful? I mean, he did a gorgeous turn of phrase, I think. Here's another one. The strains of a slashing but unfamiliar reel floated out on the night air from the lowered windows of Finucane's Hall, caught my ear one Saturday night when Tommy Owens was playing for a party. Being on duty as desk sergeant at the time, and as the police station was just across the street, I'd little difficulty memorising that tune. Can you imagine him? On a balmy night like this, you know what it's like, the way music kind of just floats across. There he's doing his job. Oh, and down he writes it. And these are the tunes that we find in his collections. And here's another one. I think it's a lovely one from the Cityscape. It's my last one. During the winter of 1875, James Moore, a young Limerick man, he could have been my neighbour, was in the habit of spending evenings in my home at Poplar Avenue. This was his first house. His boarding house across the street, although plastered, was yet without doors and far from comfortable, compared to a cosy seat in the wood box back at our kitchen stove. Not having a flute of his own, so somebody with very little means, he enjoyed playing on mine, and being an expert on the instrument, it can well be imagined how welcome he was. While he had wonderful assortment of good tunes, he seemed to regard names for them as of little consequence, a very common failing. I put my hand up, I'm terrible too. The Greencastle hornpipe, one of the best traditional tunes in our collection, came from Moore, as well as many others too numerous to mention. He went to New York in the spring and was never heard from again thereafter in Chicago. One wonders, did he have a good life? Did he have a successful life? Did he keep playing his music? Such are some of the many rich and beautiful excerpts in this book. And from these passages, we learn much about the living conditions of the immigrants in Chicago and the invariable kind of mobility associated with, or immobility in many cases, associated with these conditions, but also the persistence of these musical practices, how people clung to these practices and made sure they could still do them. And I don't know, the kinds of things that typified approach to the genre at times, like whether people knew the names of tunes or not, what they cared about, how they shared the music socially. So it really is kind of a sociological study in this sense. But in spite of his protestations in the preface that there was no alluring prospect of gaining glory to do this publication, he was saying, I was never going to make money. I'm not sure he really believed that. He was well aware of the commercial viability of his publication, given that, and this is a direct quote, Ern's exiles, whether on the sun-scorched plains of Hindustan or the snow-clad barrens of Alaska or beneath the Southern Cross in Australia and New Zealand, melted to tears or roused to example valour on hearing the strains of cherished melody that recorded the scenes and sounds of their youth. He knew that there was a whole population who wanted this music. And of course, he deliberately used this word Éireann as opposed to Ireland, and the music of Éireann, which for me takes on a very particular identity in the United States that it doesn't have in Ireland. So he's already starting to make those acts of translation and moving to this home context. So his job in the Metropolitan Police Force kind of broadened his opportunity, as he says himself, of indulging in his fascinating hobby, for this Irish music, a fascinating hobby. So he was transferred to Deering Street Station, which was home to a large Irish community, and he found traditional musicians and singers to be, as he said himself, delightfully numerous. including people like patrolman Partigo Mahoney or Big Pat, a fiddle player from Clare with a large store of unusual and rare tunes. These are all coming directly from this book now. From impromptu concerts in the station, apparently patrolmen used to use broomsticks for percussion instruments, to encounters with Civil War pipers who were playing on steamboats, O'Neill's neighbourhood beat allowed him access to all kinds of experience that morphed Irish and Midwest regionalism into one entity. The same chapter continues with a litany of players, fiddlers, pipers, dancers, many of whom were originally from Ireland, others who came to Chicago via other American locations, and also generational Irish-American families and Scottish families. Piper Hicks, for example, who came to Chicago via Boston, was lauded for giving O'Neill a large number of tunes, and as somebody who used to play, O'Neill says himself, to large and cosmopolitan audiences, not just to the ethnic Irish or Irish-American, in Connolly's Salon on the Duplain Street in 1880s. So, you know, the pub was already a site for these kinds of, I suppose, more accessible forms of presentation of Irish music. These shows were apparently easy to put on, he says, given that Americans of, and I quote, wealth and social distinction, and proud of their Irish ancestry, often approached O'Neill to get a suitable programme together for a concert. So he himself positioned himself as the mediator in all of this. Some of the neighbourhoods referred to are Canaryville, down in the stockyards, where O'Neill tracked a youthful prodigy in fiddle, and he went frequently to the south side, and he used to have select gatherings in Lakeview. It wasn't all about Bridgeport. In fact, he would say that he didn't get most of his music there at all. It was actually in the west and sometimes the north of the city. And of course, these are all places we recognise, sometimes now under layers of gentrification. But you can peel back those layers like an onion and find them there. Key encounters in particular included meeting the great piper Bernard Dillane, who, you know, everybody came out in force to see him, including Alderman Michael McNerney, and James O'Neill. James Early was another great piper for him. Other players like Delaney played in salons, one on Ashland Avenue, and there was other people like Kelly who played and entertained appreciative audiences there. He names all these different locations across the city, so you can start to imagine traversing it yourself and reimagining this. Crucially, O'Neill did not limit himself just to Irish musicians. A fascinating hobby makes the very important step to include Scottish musicians in the pool of resources for O'Neill's work. And in later chapters, he points to these connections between Irish and Scottish and other repertoires, kind of moving outside of a national Irish narrative to show again how migratory patterns work and how music is exchanged. This direct affiliation of Irish-Scottish music is very important because what Chicago also does, and I'll get to it shortly, is create a context for this idea of Celtic music. And it's something you get in the United States a lot that you simply don't get prior to the 1990s at least, and those kind of commodification times of this term Celtic and what it might mean. So it's more expansive, it's more inclusive, and it's not tied to a nationalist narrative, and that's very important. Are you okay with me? Are you with me so far? Yeah, okay. It's a lot of words. I'm conscious of that. So what I want to do then is, oh yeah, actually, so remember I mentioned the Green Castle hornpipe? There it is. So you look at that tune, and then you have that story. It sort of changes how you feel about that tune, I think, when you try to play it. So then, am I raving? Am I just reading way too much into this? Maybe, but I'm going to try and do it with this book, and you can tell me if you buy this or not. So, The Music of Ireland, 1903, published downtown in Chicago. The 1903 locally produced Lyne and Healy edition of Music of Ireland is a substantial book in size and in weight. It features 366 pages of beautiful, thick, creamy paper and is bound, as you can see here, in a dark green cloth impressed with gold lettering of a Celtic theme, with similar Celtic spirals and knotwork found in more fulsome title in the next page. There's actually copies of this in the library upstairs. There's also a couple of copies in the Newbury, but it's not found as extensively as I would have expected in Chicago, though I do know it's in private collections. The book opens up with a 4-page introduction by the author, which stakes a claim for the size, city of the big shoulders, right? For the size and the originality of this project. He also underscores the importance of melody, in particular, as a repository for authentic music, and he outlines his motivations and processes of why he's doing this. And what he really emphasizes is the local input to the project. Part of his collecting process involved, as I said, engaging in fieldwork practices across the city, and his scribe, James O'Neill, worked alongside him, taking down tunes from performers, or from O'Neill, who memorised the music at events he attended. O'Neill, at the time, apparently wasn't literate in music, so he couldn't transcribe it, but I think looking at some of his annotations, certainly later in life, he had a better sense of how to do that. From the outset, O'Neill was quite clever. I mean, again, he would be super on Twitter. He kind of fetishized his own authenticity and insiderness as a kind of this genuine immigrant from Ireland, who came to Chicago. And when he introduces music of Ireland, he talks about his natural, domestic and authentic background in Ireland, where, he sat on his mother's knee and she sang lullabies. And I think this happens to a lot of people, but he creates this beautiful romantic idyll, actually, that's very, very seductive. But what you'll also find is he says things in this introduction, and he also says it in A Fascinating Hobby. He sort of reveals this very steely determination of him wanting to create this totalizing narrative, and he was going to get his tunes come hell or high water. He wasn't just going to ask, he was going to find ways to do it. So he talks about manuscript collections scarcely decipherable from age, because he did take it from books, not just people as well, would be with certain families, and they were heirlooms. But he was given special favour as the compiler. And you're not always sure to what degree this was to do with his pedigree and insiderness, or because he was the superintendent of police and you didn't want to cross him, And this is important, actually. This metaphor of police is kind of important to me, at least anyway, because it seems to me this disciplining that he was doing of creating this narrative of Irish music and this definitive book sort of required a little bit of gentle coercion from time to time. For example, sometimes when he was out on the beat or attending an event, he would be always observing, writing down the notes, taking information from wherever he could. And he actually says himself he deployed musicians to help him uncover several pet tunes. So, if you're poor and you barely have an instrument and your only capital is your music, you might want to hold on to that. But O'Neill was going to get it because he was creating a book with every tune under the sun in that book. So he would do it. So he deployed musicians to get these pet tunes, which were being withheld for various reasons. I mean, people also are jealous and they don't want to share their tunes or whatever. And his powerful and loyal team actually used to do his bidding. So he created his very conditions he actually invited lots of people, lots of musicians onto the police force. This is a fact. Now, they were also obviously very good at their job, but it just meant, he was able to position them around the city and create his collectors, basically. And so this is what he says. It's kind of extraordinary. He says, he conceived of a scheme of ingratiating himself. This is Patrolman Ennis. So he worked with Patrolman Ennis, and he would kind of ingratiate himself with people and sort of feign disinterest or unconcern about somebody playing this great tune, but they'd be like, ooh, and he'd run off afterwards and jot it down really quickly. And then, of course, put it into this book. Now, it is funny, but it raises kind of interesting issues about ownership and who capitalizes from these publications. But that's what he did. He obviously got tunes from people who wanted to share with him as well. And they came from a variety of sources. Now, what was very good about O'Neill, though, is he did not simply look for this kind of notion of newly arrived, authentic musicians fresh off the boat who could hardly, who were still speaking Gaeilge and, hadn't been tainted by the sins of the city. He wasn't like that at all. He was constantly moving to the older communities. He was working with Irish Americans. He was working with people in related genres and other national and ethnic backgrounds who were playing Irish music. So he was very open to all of these things. And though he makes the claim that within the limits of the city, a territory comprising of the 32 counties of Ireland can be found, if you actually look closely, stylistically, that's not the case in the books at all. And the other thing is, and Nicholas Carlin says this, that really it was about 34 Irish-born musicians in Chicago that provide the bulk of the music for these books. And maybe it's slightly, as it is today, overrepresented by the West and the Southwest, not every part of the city. So O'Neill only ever put in one round of a tune, just one skeletal round, very little ornamentation. In some cases, he did do little quirky things, but mostly it was quite fundamental and quite basic. And people were critical of him for this because they said, look, you've got all these amazing musicians. This is afterwards. You've got all these amazing musicians. Why wouldn't you transcribe absolutely everything you do rather than put this very kind of basic sort of descriptive or telling you how to play this music. But Nicholas Carlin said, well, no, if you think about O'Neill, let's think about it fairly. He was creating this book for people who already knew how to play Irish music, so they were just using it as mnemonic devices. They only needed to see the tune, so that's why. But then you have other people, including 2 University of Chicago professors, Philip Bowman and formerly Martin Stokes, actually Philip Bowman is still in the Department of Music, who said actually maybe these books were not just for Irish traditional musicians at all, because how many were literate? Certainly throughout the 20th century you find that many of them were, but how many of them were at that point? And if you're going to save tunes for the people who play them, surely you do it in a more accessible and affordable format. Maybe this was actually coming out of a sort of a culture of those kind of how-to books that were very popular, things like the Columbian Exposition and World Fairs. You have this beautiful book that you want other people to buy as well and send around the world, you know, a kind of a fetish object. So these are all things to consider, and I suppose as we look at the table of contents, you can see that this wasn't necessarily all the dance music of Ireland at all. I mean, there are jigs and reels in there, but actually the biggest proportion is taken up by song airs, the melodies of song airs. And lots of these were taken from manuscripts as well. He didn't always tell you, though, which were from people and which were from manuscripts. And again, this is part of this totalizing narrative. It's all one thing that's presented beautifully to us, but the nuances of this aren't always available. And I would think that he was doing this because he wanted maximum authorial impact and maximum commercial impact as well. He wanted, you know, you would want to buy this book from him. What's really interesting is if you look at how well the book is planned. For me, when I look at this book, and I hope when you go back and look at it, the layout sort of reveals his very pragmatic and modernist approach to representation. Everything is carefully planned and zoned and executed beautifully. Tunes conform to kind of a particular standardized representation. Labels appear consistent throughout. There's extremely good cross-referencing. If you look at from an aerial perspective, you start to see that the scaffolding of Music of Ireland into these neat and accessible blocks, he was providing readers with a sort of aerial view of this landscape of Irish tradition, beautifully kind of packaged and topographically embodied in this book, which was, to me, I see huge parallels between that and these kinds of maps which were in circulation following the Columbian Exposition in 1893, these kinds of representations of this new modern city. I think he was hugely influenced in that, because if you look at other collections prior to this coming out of Ireland and elsewhere, they didn't do it this way. It wasn't this detailed, it wasn't this organised. In liking, I guess, an aerial view to the commercial hub of Chicago with Music of Ireland, it's possible to see how order is imposed and difference is disciplined and contained within the book. O'Neill's indexical grids echo Chicago Street. They move, they parallel, they intersect. And like a bird's eye map of the city as a means of negotiating its vastness, O'Neill's index just as clearly marks pathways for the music, but with a very particular orientation. According to Berman, early 20th century urban design has been systematically designed to ensure collision and confrontation won't take place. So such production processes, I think, are played out in the Music of Ireland, where these technologies of order are created. There's a kind of a legibility superimposed by these collections from all these random people and random books put together in this beautiful navigating thing. And of course, O'Neill is the author, so it makes him the ultimate author. It makes him the chief right on top, creating this thing for us. Of course, you all know from a bird's eye view that while you get this totalizing perspective, the minutiae and the tiny details can go missing, and that's often a criticism of O'Neill. It's not entirely fair, I don't think. But what it does is, you have this book with 366 pages with, on average, 6 to 8 tunes per page. I mean, they're stacked on each other like a skyscraper, you know? He just rams everything in. It's just rammed in together, and it just, you know, and you go through pages after pages, and you are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of knowledge and the sheer kind of oceans of this stuff coming at you, which at the same time is beautifully, beautifully done. There's another thing he does too. The theorist Raymond Williams, whom I love, talks about language and what happens in the modern metropolis, that it stops becoming a social custom and actually becomes this interesting medium. And O'Neill was very aware of this. He kind of used language very carefully in order to create a particular kind of truth. So what he does is, on one side of the page, I'll go back. So on one side of the page, if you can see on the right-hand side, sorry, it's quite blurry, but on one side, he puts the Irish language version of the tune. And on the other side, he puts the English language version, and this is consistent throughout all the pages, right? So he uses the ancient kind of Irish script. He doesn't use a modern Irish script. And so it looks like that the tune titles were translated from the original Irish into the English. At least that's how I read it, if it's set up that way, right? I think you can make an argument for that. Now, of course, the fact is that many of these tunes were sourced in English, and he just translated them back into Irish to create a consistency. And the other thing was many of the tune titles weren't available, so he made them up. And he translated them back into Irish, right? And he was quite open about this, but when you open the tune book, you don't know this. You don't know this necessarily, right? At all. So he's not hiding it, but in the book itself, it's kind of concealed. So language is used both historically to reference the past, to authenticate, and also structurally to kind of create, again, this totalizing narrative. So this deployment of the Irish and English title kind of positions the author as this mediator between this authentic Irish tradition and this kind of commoditized tradition for the public. Now, he was a supporter of the Irish language and Irish cultural expressions, and he also used, as he said, the cúpla focal, the Irish couple of words, wherever he could. But he says that while I speak and read Irish, I have not attempted an Irish manuscript. I have to rely on the Béarla. I have to rely on English. But he was aware of it as not a social custom anymore, but as this very nice medium he could use to authenticate his project. The mere presence of Irish meant that the purchaser felt they were buying something authentic and real, something that was being mediated for them by the wonderful O'Neill. And in many ways, that's one of the greatest achievements of this book, Music of Ireland. It manages to create this book that's really for musicians, because musicians use this, and especially 1001, which is the 1907 collection. But at the same time, it's also something that appeals for the masses, because it's beautiful. People don't know necessarily even what the Irish is or how to read it, but it looks good, and it's a beautiful product. One of the final ways in which the entire publishing project was entirely integrated and makes it very much, for me, a product of its time and place in Chicago was the deployment of Celtic design throughout. Not Irish design or Irish art, but Celtic. Which is part of, I suppose, 19th century Romanticism, but it's also very much, again, part of that Columbian Exposition 1893 down in the Midway Plaisance, where there were 2 Irish villages and there were Celtic designs everywhere. And it's a huge thing in the Midwest, actually. And I have a colleague down at the University of Notre Dame who works on this idea of medieval Chicago. And it's everywhere. It's all over this building, too, these kinds of Celtic designs. So O'Neill used stylized Celtic fonts throughout. He was kind of responding to Celtic iconography, which is a massive commodity culture. There was so much jewellery, Celtic jewellery made in the city and for sale in the city, so many Celtic things. Arts and crafts, these were one of the greatest crowd pleasers in the late 1890s. And really, in fact, places like Chicago were the global hubs of Celtic art and material culture, not Dublin or Cork or Limerick, not at all. So this is another layer that goes into this book. Conflating the Celt and the Gael was also very clever, because he included music that wasn't Irish. So you're making the music of Ireland, and yet there are so many tunes in there that are from Scotland, and there are actually tunes that creep in that are from American traditions as well. And actually in his later publications, he has called Waifs and Strays, he's lots of other ethnic musics that creep in also. And this is because he was like, I'm not going to limit myself to ethnic Irish, maybe because they don't all have the money to buy the book, but also he actually had a more expansive vision. And this is what he says in the kind of introduction: to the multitude of non-professional musicians of the Gaelic and English-speaking races all over the world. That's very diplomatic. It's not saying to Irish people, and that's it, you're the only people who can buy this. Gaelic and English-speaking races all over the world who enjoy and cherish the melodies of Ireland. This work is respectfully dedicated to you. So it may have been the melodies of Ireland, but it wasn't for just people of Irish identity, even in Chicago and beyond. He was just sending it out into the world, at least in my take. So then O'Neill worked not only with local community members of Irish and non-Irish backgrounds, but also with a global community of people involved in music, people in Australia, in other parts of the world. And he believed in the Celtic aesthetic. You may not know that he was involved with the pageant of the Celt in 1934. He was part of the music of that, and he really believed in it. And he was also somebody who understood how ethnic relationships worked in the city, and how important it was to be accommodating to a larger sense of what constituted or what Irish identity could be in the broader sense. And really, ultimately, in a way, he was creating his community through the people who purchased the book. You didn't have to have that Irish passport or the Irish brogue or whatever it was. That's not what it was about. It was about your passion for this music. And in fact, in many ways, he's really much a man of this time in terms of that sort of expensive sort of view. So I'm just putting up two quotes for you there. One from Lewis Mumford. What is a city? It's an economic organization. It's an institutional process. Don't just think of it as buildings. It's a theatre of social action. That's what a city is. It's an aesthetic symbol of collective unity. The city fosters art. It is art. It creates theatre, and it is theatre. The city as theatre, that's where man's most purposive activities are focused and work out through conflicting and cooperative personalities, events, groups, into more significant culminations. I mean, he could have been writing about O'Neill's collecting processes. And there's O'Neill himself. Irish music is neither dead nor dying in this great Western metropolis. For the young generation of Irish-American musicians bid fair to rival their progenitors in the divine art which gentler upon the spirit lies than tired eyelids upon tired eyes. So, what am I trying to say? Definitely, Music of Ireland, 1001 Melodies, Waifs and Strays, all those tunes book, did for an Irish public and for an Irish musicking community across the world, but specifically in Ireland, in many ways save Irish music, because these books were sent back and they were used by people. And they were used throughout the 20th century by people in Chicago too. But it was also, to my mind, a modernist urban project, and it doesn't get enough kind of credit for that. So to conclude, phew, you all say. In 1904, O'Neill, just 1 year after the publication of The Music of Ireland and the recording of his cylinders, lost his 18-year-old son, a promising college student and violinist, to meningitis. You may not know this, but he had 10 children, 5 sons and 5 daughters, and 1 daughter, and all of his sons died. 3 dying in childhood on the same day from diphtheria. So O'Neill's biographer Nicholas Carlin notes the following, and I quote, "In deference to his wife's feelings, he no longer played music in the house after 1904. And he stored his cylinder sound recordings and cylinder player in the home of a friend, removing all music from the house, including records, and giving them to Early. And Early in turn gave them to the Dunn family, and this is where they emerge in Milwaukee, just very recently. Now, ultimately, of course, he goes on to do more book writing, and that's a much more quiet process. And the other thing is that he had more authorial control over the materials in a book rather than on a sound recording, because they're there, they're fixed, there's nothing you can change. And he also responded to the market. 1907, 1001 Melodies, focused on dance music, and other tune books had arrangements, piano arrangements in them, and that's a story for another day. The wonderful young Selina O'Neill, who did extraordinary variations on that. And O'Neill talks about how he started to make books more cheap so that people could access them and maybe buy them, but the market was starting to deteriorate, and even though he says himself, I got great reviews, the product didn't move in the same way. But he persisted, and he wrote more and did more research, and perhaps at that stage was less collecting tunes and more bringing his considerable library together to write other books. So to kind of conclude, in much of his writings, but especially in The Music of Ireland, O'Neill revealed this modernist urge to write a definitive narrative of Irish music, and to render this version of this narrative the most real and the most authentic, the biggest and the best, and to package it for audiences located across the Irish diaspora for sure, and locally, but also beyond for anybody who might want to take it on board. O'Neill may have felt that his work was in vain as he watched Irish Music Club disband due to a certain level of infighting, and he had his beautiful collections reduced to the basement bargain bins, apparently after he died in 1936 in Lyne and Healy. They could be found selling for, I think it was 5 cents. But of course, he should have been reassured, because like everything else in this ever-physical changing landscape of the city, the music itself would also renew itself with subsequent generations and enjoy his original book as well as reprints for years to come. And you can get many reprints still to this day, and much of his work is online and people are still accessing it all the time. And 2020 will be the 150th, or 2021, it depends, people debate about that, will be the 150th year of O'Neill's arrival in Chicago. Party! Yeah? And of course, it continues through festive activities. There's so much, and other forms of monumentalizing. And so, I hope that what I've done is try to not just put Chicago at the center of this, but also complicate this narrative of a man who was himself complicated. He had wonderful facets, but he also was quite singular in his vision as well. And in many ways, you have to maybe be that way to move forward. It's a tricky one. But I'm going to stop there because I've talked for quite a long time. And I would hope that maybe we could have some discussion. It would be great if we could do that. And I thank you very much for your very, very quiet attention. So thank you. Right. Yes. He did, but not for 40 years after he arrived. And he was invited to do things in various places and judge competitions. And he was really shocked, actually, with the state of music in Ireland. Because, of course, even though O'Neill complained about the fact that Irish musicians couldn't get proper financial support for doing gigs here, I think Irish musicians sometimes still feel that way. Some things never change. There was absolutely no kind of institutional support whatsoever. And, you had no organisations like Colfa's Culture Éireann didn't happen until decades later. And, the landscape had been quite decimated post-famine. And, Ireland was picking itself up as it was after 1916, so, it was in ruins. And, of course, people were still playing music, but it didn't have that same vibrancy. Or to me, what you find about Irish music here is it was very kind of implicated in civic life. And I don't know, many of you look like you would be old enough to have attended the Celtic Fest, Mayor Daly's Celtic Fest in the 1990s and the 1990s, right? I mean, that thing, you could trace that back to the pageant of the Celt in 1934, back to the Columbian Exposition in the Irish villages. There's a stronger heritage here of staging and supporting Irish music in many ways than there is in Ireland. So yeah, I went back in 1940, and then I don't think he went back much more after that. I think he kept a holiday home. Was it in Mexico? Did I read that somewhere? That's in the Skeleton Lesh book. Oh, was it? Oh, was it Mississippi? I was thinking maybe it was there. I don't know. I can't remember that. But so yeah, he became very much, this was his home. This was home. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. No. I think Waifs and Strays is really fascinating because, of course, Waifs and Strays implies this is the flotsam and jetsam, it's the stuff that's left. But for me, it's his most kind of. It's kind of ambitious because it's his most integrated and ethnically diverse collection. I love what he's doing in it. I think he was shaped by the city, and he recognised that there were many musics there, and there's some what people would call American vernacular tunes in there, but he got lambasted for it in Irish critical reception history. Tommaso kind of was like, what is this bag of bone tunes? Because they didn't understand the context in which he was operating. And I guess this is why I'm so passionate about making that argument. You cannot judge O'Neill for the apparent mistakes he made. You actually have to reread back in and say he was doing something very clever and very kind of encompassing and inviting in some ways. Yeah.
He sees this one is like this and like this.
Yeah, and he does annotations, so you don't get that in 1903. You get the totalizing narrative in 1903, and you get the kind of more space to maneuver in Waifs and Strays, which is kind of between 1922 and 1924. That's his last tune book. Jesse, you had a question.
Yeah, when you talk about the lack of ornaments,
not always, though. Yeah.
Not always, right.
Yeah.
That you have a tune one time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think about the way O'Neill's exists, like for us who play the music, disagreement between a couple of players about how a tune goes, and one of them says, well, I'm playing it the way it goes in O'Neill's, that's the end of the concert. So,
that's also a very Chicago thing, can I say?
Okay. So I think, maybe this was cleverness or not, but getting rid of most of the ornaments, let's say, and variations puts emphasis on the notes,
Mm-hmm.
which then allows that to be authoritative in the play. Where if you had 3 times through and all of the ornaments that a person plays, it draws attention to, well, this is how that person played it that one night, maybe if O'Neill remembered it right.
And it's a very important nuance that you're making, because the idea of doing transcriptions that detail everything, that's a descriptive transcription versus a prescriptive. But even these aren't prescriptive, because they are giving you the contours all right. And in some cases there are some really quirky transcriptions in there. So I don't totally buy the argument that this was a how-to book, not at all. But definitive collections. I mean, he was in this process, I think, kind of canonizing himself.
I think that fits your narrative that he's an architect of a way to interpret the
Mm-hmm.
work, and is that he picked a way to put the tunes in there that could feel authoritative to us.
I think we're singing from the same hymn sheet, which is nice. That's a very, very astute observation. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for coming to Chicago again. And also, secondly, did you have the opportunity to meet any of the family in the city?
No, I never met. And it's Mary Lesh would be the main. She co-edited with Ellen Skerritt, who's a marvelous historian who's worked on kind of Catholic history here in Chicago. They edited together O'Neill's memoirs in 2008. But no, I haven't. I didn't, unfortunately, get any of the opportunity. Maybe you can hook me up. Are there any? Yeah. Oh, okay. We'll meet at the bar after this. Okay. Yeah, we'll have a chat. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to imagine how they might respond to these ideas. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. This is just really wonderful.
Thank you.
Just to ask, do you think that when you made the point that the Irish coming here, obviously they coming from the different regions,
Mm-hmm.
and this is probably the first time that they would have been all together.
Yes.
One city. And so I'm just wondering, do you think there was an emergence of a particular Chicago style out of a fusion of all those?
That's a super question, and that's something that Lawrence McCullough tried to address in his 1973 thesis, and he concluded no. And I mean, I've spoken, in many ways I'm not the person to answer this question, Sean or Liz or anybody else who has lived here and lived through it. In the later generations, obviously, you're not 150. But from conversations with Sean and from other people, from older musicians and Liz and lots of other people, there was a sense that people, if you came from Kerry and you're from Glen, you met your buddies in the house and you went to this place, and woe betide you'd hang out with the Donegal crew. So the degree to which people were, I don't know, this is what I hear, the degree to which people were trading tunes and creating kind of a Chicago sound. In some ways, I'd reverse the question and say, have we constructed this notion of a regional style in Ireland out of the wonderful individuals who were recorded? So sometimes we think one, it was there forever. But I think these things can be deconstructed in many, many ways. Lawrence McCullough would say there is no Chicago style. But there's a whole chapter in my thesis dedicated to that woman there. And I think if you're talking about maverickness, you can look at the kind of compositions. I do think compositionally from the 70s onwards, there's a Chicago thing happening. I do hear that. I hear that in people's compositions.
I agree entirely. I was just wondering if there so much from that.
No, in part maybe because people were recirculating repertoire, and lots of the tunes, like we'll say Star Monster, everybody might have known them. There are a couple of versions, like there's a version of Bannis Misfortune by Edward Cronin, which is on one of the cylinders, and it's completely different from the one I would know. And so again, I think we have to think less in kind of regional style sense and think about like extraordinary maverick individuals who sometimes shared ways of approaching things, but sometimes just did their thing, But it's a great question. Lawrence McCullough would have said, I've tried, and he does this huge thesis. It's like, no. And so does Mick Maloney, actually. It's a great question. Yes, Liz.
I was going to say I enjoyed this so much too.
Thank you, Liz.
Since you were talking about the Wasteland Strays, I thought you might enjoy. I know that when I was 17 and I was going to play in Ireland at the All Ireland I picked a tune out of The Waifs and Strays. So it was a piece that was called Young Terence McDonough. And Young Terence McDonough, in the writing of the tune, there were double stops. So if you don't know what double stops are, you think about a triad of a chord, and the fiddle is really only able to hit 2 of those notes without doing a big splash over to the next string. So it was just full of little double stops.
Yeah.
And I thought that was quite wonderful. And I played that in Ireland. And I didn't get anywhere playing in the air competition because
God
I
forbid.
was disqualified for playing, and I didn't know. I
Yeah.
had never played it. So the idea of, at that time, of doing double stops at a competition in Ireland
Yeah.
was not allowed. It was allowed the next year.
You broke the mold yet again.
But it was that thought that,
Yeah.
wow, this book is from like 1913.
I know,
Or
but-
whatever, and it wasn't allowed. So I thought it was fun.
But you see, but what's so interesting, and this is a much broader debate, and maybe somebody can do this topic for the lecture next year, is this idea of what's permissible and what's not, and who gets to control that narrative. And you know, the kind of is Oisin here? No, I can't. This is going on television. No, I'm only joking, Oisin. The early cultus, you know, and as it moved, it's never one thing. It negotiates all the time, you know. And I think it was with James. We were talking about this idea of in Ireland even, let alone forget about the diaspora. I mean, I'm waiting for the Broken Pledge Céilí Band to win the senior Céilí Band competition. It needs to happen. But whatever about that, and Liz, of course, broke the mold, being the first Irish-American to win the FLA. The junior and senior, by the way. She gave me a brown envelope to say that, but we'll celebrate it again. You know, there are constant hierarchies, and they're negotiating, they're shifting all of the time. So, you know, if you're from Clare, well, you're blessed, you know, if you're a Clare fiddler. But, you know, if you're from Bagnallstown in County Carlow, which, by the way, right now has a fabulous tradition. Where? So these kinds of things. And then also, like, you know, O'Neill is lauded as this man. Well, surely we can play from his collection, because is he not the person who put this together? Why can't you do it this way? These things are constantly negotiated. And one of the tensions that happens is that there's this, I suppose, revision of who belongs to Irish music and how one controls it when Ireland itself goes through its political change, and it needs to create its narrative of difference and kind of control and corral. So there's another kind of controlling and corralling that goes on there. It's negotiated, renegotiated all the time. I'd love to have heard those double stops, though. Do you have your fiddle, Liz? You should play it for us. I bet you they were, yes.
Well, I was just going to make a point because the whole focus thing as well. That's so
I love Donegal, by the way.
it's so subjective.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
just think that's ridiculous. That's how the music of Ireland is being
Yeah.
communicated now.
Yeah.
And I have an example of the Donegal set.
Mhm.
Building is something that's more renowned.
Absolutely.
But a lot of musicians coming up through the ranks too, regardless of playing flute or whatever they
Mhm.
play, and are still playing in the Donegal style. And I know somebody who went through the All Ireland was just told, why are you truly coming in here playing that on the flute? How dare you?
Yeah.
I'm not interested in hearing your second tune.
Yeah. I think one of the greatest things that Cultus at a local level has done as an organisation, and you've branches here in this city, is it has just created a space for kids and adults to learn this music, you know. And lots of people go through the competition system. I never really liked it myself. I'm not a good solo player. I prefer to be on ensembles anyway. But these things shift and they're negotiated all the time. And I mean, if you were to go back to Ireland now, and you would see a very different landscape with Irish traditional music, because in the last 15 years there has been such a shift in migratory patterns into Ireland. I think 25% of Irish people have been born outside of Ireland now, and you have wonderful ethnic diversities in the back of nowhere schools in County Clare, and you have extraordinary musicians from very different backgrounds coming through the system as well. So it's changing every single decade.
Musical literacy now.
Yeah,
Like, we were all in Cork,
yeah,
different stages.
yeah,
And yes, Irish music was very prominent there.
yeah,
At that stage, somebody coming in as an Irish musician would not necessarily know how to read music.
yeah.
And that whole rhythmic now,
I know.
all the different colleges that are giving degrees.
Yeah.
And musical literacy is just
It is,
teaching now,
absolutely.
and doing all that, and that actually has changed things as well.
It totally has. And you know, sometimes the spearheading comes from this side of the pond, sometimes it comes from the Irish side. But for me, Irish music is a global music. There's no two ways about it. And you don't have to have, in any level, any ethnic ties with it, but it can also be something that can be very much about your identity if you want. And these are the kinds of challenges that people face around curriculum and around style and around these kinds of things. But once the music keeps being played, you know, that's all we really want, I think. But yeah, you know, competition culture, it can be hard. It can be really hard on kids. Yes?
Is there any evidence of the book traveling to other, you mentioned Celtic music?
Yeah,
Is that other
yeah.
Celtic regions?
Yes, absolutely.
Galicia or
Oh, Galicia is a great, oh, I know.
Normandy? Yeah.
Well, that's like, that would be a lovely funded project. That's a great question. I think we'll put an appeal out on TV right now. You know, that's a great question. I think you'd have to go to actual libraries and repositories to find, but because Lion Healy had quite a good distribution network, I think it was also people bought the book and sent it to people. I still think it's predominantly English language and Irish language, so I would say Scottish, Welsh, but you know, most definitely there's, you know, South America. The Global South is the big thing now with Irish studies at the moment, and people are really paying attention to that, and actually to Sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, it's the kind of object that it was beautiful enough to give to somebody, at least the 1903 music of Ireland. And I think it's a question of, yeah, it would be really interesting to know if you could go to Cuba and find it.
Well,
Will you let
it's a
us?
great reservoir
Yeah.
of, great melodies.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating to see how other related, you know, cultures would make their own.
For sure, and I mean those kinds of, that sort of hybridization is an inherent part of what O'Neill was doing too. I mean, bringing these other repertoires together, and hybridity is to my mind, but I think you could probably figure out my leaning by the way I talk, is a very positive thing, and that kind of cultural exchange, and you know, I think it's really, really good. But no, it's a great question, and I don't know anybody who's discovered that. I think predominantly it's libraries in what would be the English language world in that respect. Yes, Sarah.
Thanks. Really interesting. And I think you're well on your way to becoming a historian.
I think I'm turning into you, actually.
So being a historian, I had a question about the peoples. You mentioned the majority or a lot of the tunes came from, I think you said 34
Yeah.
in particular. Is there any sense of why those 34 people or why not more?
I think the people who've done the research on this, and it's some really good stuff, Paul de Grey brought out a chapter in 2012 on this and looked at it, is because number one, these people had amazing repertoires. And number two, they were invested in O'Neill's project. And so, you know, in many ways, I'm not 100% convinced O'Neill was trying to find every tune that was out there in the world. I think he was making that claim for the book that we have pretty much every tune that's out there in the world. But he was getting so much richness from these people that he was working with and that were in his sphere. I think that was largely it. And it's not exclusively so. I mean, if you go through in many of the cases in the book, you know, he will put on the right-hand side F. O'Neill saying the tune came from me, or James O'Neill, or Early, or, you know, there are women in there as well. Not many, but they are there. And so he will give credit if he kind of literally got it from one of his contemporaries. But I think the people that he got the tunes from, like, he just loved, and he showed bias, he loved their repertoires. He loved their repertoires. Yes, James.
So these collections were extremely impactful and revolutionary, and he was very methodical in the way that he organized them, and they were organized very specifically. And I was just wondering if the work you've done to try and understand to what degree his influence caused, if any, a paradigm shift amongst traditional Irish musicians, amongst the music as it existed before these collections,
Yeah.
and then afterwards.
I mean, I think that's a great question. It's a massive question to try and answer. One of the things that most people will say about these collections, especially the 1907 1001 Melodies, is that musicians themselves felt like these were collections that spoke to them because they were dance tunes. Prior collections, I mean, you had Joyce and you had other collections as well, but many of them were Anglo-Irish antiquarian collections that were arranged in very specific ways that kind of didn't feel like they spoke to musicians. So most definitely throughout the 20th century in Ireland, and I've spoken to Sean about this in Chicago as well, there's constant evidence of people getting together to put up the book, the Bible, it was actually known as the 1907 collection, and learn tunes out of it. And you guys often speak of, in the Chicago context, it seems very, very real here, that this sense of O'Neill's version or none. That's not something I ever experienced, I have to say, in West Limerick. But I think it could have happened in other places. But I mean, in many ways, I guess, successive generations were apostles of kind and maybe felt one had to adhere to that. So I think it would be good to do...
Adhere to which part of that?
Maybe musicians here felt that the kind of that legacy upon them. I don't know. It's something that, I'd love to talk to you about because. Yeah, I mean, well, the fact, I guess, that you drew from it, yeah. I mean, did it feel like this repository of kind of extraordinary stuff for you?
I think maybe not so much from us sitting down reading a book, but when you kind of would listen to recordings in which that was the source. Then you go in and you find that tune and see what they did. I know that Paddy O'Brien and Seamus Connolly, when they did that great duet album years ago, they have Mayor Harrison's Fedora and that selection and all. But I know talking to Paddy O'Brien years ago that they sat down and they had that book open and they were just enjoying themselves going along and trying to find tunes. But what's amazing with these cylinders that you were talking about, Aileen, is that it is pretty amazing to hear the actual musicians whose name is on the right there. So, so I would be looking at some of the fiddle names, and when I would see McFadden, and then you suddenly hear, you're probably experiencing what I am. It's a real
goosebumps.
It's goosebumps.
Totally.
Because the tune wasn't just as it was written.
It wasn't at all.
And it was fantastic playing, and there were great variations.
Yeah.
They were every bit as good as Coleman and everybody that got to record in the 20s.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know.
No one knew. I don't know. I don't think we knew that.
I mean,
that certainly didn't come down through any pipeline.
Yeah.
We didn't know that till we heard those cylinders.
Yeah.
That Cronin version of Banish's Fortune.
That is extraordinary. It's extraordinary.
I heard the recording, I thought,
You're like,
oh my
what the hell?
God.
That's why it works. Yeah.
Tommy Potts meets Charlie Parker.
Yeah.
I mean, not Tommy Potts meets Charlie Parker. Like, I can imagine.
Absolutely.
How great that was when I heard that.
No, it is good. And literally,
I looked at it again, and it was kind of faithfully reproduced.
it is, and that's the thing. So
Passed it by for 40 years. Never paid attention ever.
I printed it out this week for some of the older kids to do, precisely for that reason. To me, it's such a Chicago kind of setting, It is amazing. But those recordings are available on the Ward Archive. You can go visit them and see them and touch them as well. Not too much though, because the wax will melt. But you can, and they are. I mean, you're listening to those and the piping and it's Patsy Toohey stuff is, and when you think Patsy Toohey played at so many of these major public events as well. I mean, he was right out there in that landscape. Yeah. So it is. It's really, really rich. The tradition here is really, really rich, and it got even richer, I would think, in the 20th century in terms of people starting to compose and put their music out there as well. And it's special, and the degree to which you buy into whether we're shaped by our surroundings or not. Okay, maybe I forced the whole topographic thing a little bit. It's more about the context in which we play together, but it's also about how we choose to kind of be maverick about the kinds of things we do as well. And I think musicians here are different from musicians in other places. I mean, that makes sense to me anyway. You have to be influenced by your surroundings, however that translates. It's not necessarily a map on simply. It's just the context in which you're allowed to evolve and grow as a musician. And even this idea of faithfully representing O'Neill or, being influenced by other sounds or musics. I think that's got to be the case. Does anybody else have any questions or comments or criticisms? I'm a big girl, I can take it. Well, I thank you very much for being such an attentive audience. Thank you.